So I'm teaching at Montclair State University too, and I'm teaching literature mostly. And very often I ask my students if biography of the author is important in any way. And I noticed that I've been always advocating against any biographical approach at all. My point was always, the author is dead, the author is fishing, the author is writing another book, we shouldn't care about the author. And then I noticed that in my own work, my biography is so important that I cannot deny it. And I found the proof that biography is something that we cannot ignore also in Lange's work. So all these questions. Is the place of birth, background, culture, education, early influences, choices, traumas, luck or the lack of luck, gender, social conditioning, physical abilities, our personal histories, are they part of our work as artists? This is something to consider. I would argue that in Lange's work, this is something that we cannot really separate from biography, her work and biography. Okay, so if you are interested in these things, artist and biography, Dorothea Lange is our, compatriot in a way. She's from the same state. She was born in New Jersey. She was homogeneously German. Her parents were born in New Jersey also, but they emigrated from Germany and they became prosperous middle class. Her father, Heinrich, was anglicized as Henry, and her mother, Johanna, as John. They married in 1894 after they most likely met in a Lutheran church. Dorothea was born in May 1895 in Hoboken, New Jersey, and her brother Henry was born when she was 6. Family moved to Weehawken and became pretty much affluent. Her mother never worked. They have the live-in maid, and the family became cultured and valued both education and art. So from her very early years, Dorothea was exposed to art, was expected to study, and was expected to know about culture. However, this careless childhood lasted only for 7 years for her. In 1902, she contracted polio, and even if she lived, it resulted in permanent damage. She had what was called the drop foot, and all her life, she was trying to hide this fact. It obviously didn't make her life any easier after she became a photographer, but for her, it was also a question of the image. And particularly, she connected it to her mother's anxiety over having a crippled child, especially a female crippled child. So possibly the incredible fastidiousness of Dorothea was linked to this trauma of childhood and the idea how she looks and how she moves. She very often blamed her mother to develop this anxiety. 1907 came another trauma, her father's disappearing. According to Dorothea, the father abandoned the family. She always talked about her father as a crook. She didn't want to have anything with him, anything to do with him. The proof of this is the fact that she adopted her mother's maiden name. But the entire story about the father is more than problematic. Most likely the father did not abandon the family, but he went into hiding. He was like forced into hiding because of his financial collapse. And most likely the parents were still meeting. Possibly John had at least one abortion during this time, but he never saw the children, he never met the children, and the children felt abandoned. Even if the father probably supported the family financially through his hardship, Dorothea's mother and two children were forced to move in with Dorothea's grandmother, maternal grandmother, and she did not remember this woman fondly. Grandmother was supposedly very tough and temperamental, to the point that Dorothea's mother had to protect Dorothea from her grandmother. It has an upside. Dorothea was enrolled in school in New York City, not in New Jersey, probably to avoid the grandmother's influence. The parents divorced in 1919. So Dorothea went to school. And at the beginning, she went to school in Hoboken and in Weehawken. And she was a relatively good student there. But when the mother moved to the grandmother and the mother took a job in New York City, the mother started to take her with her to New York City, and Dorothea went to school in the city. This enrollment to the public school on the 62th Lower East Side became as a shock to her. She found herself not up to the task. She found herself not such a good student comparing to her peers. And this probably formed her attitude towards school. She started to skip school, she started to walk the city, she saw herself from her very early years as a flaneur, as an observer of the city life. This attitude continued when she moved to school in the Bronx, and when she became friends with Fonzie Alstorm, who became her friend and like partner in crime in skipping school. Together, they enrolled in New York City College for the training of teachers, but this was not the choice for Dorothea eventually. What the city really did was that it exposed her to photography. When she told her family that she wanted to be a photographer, it came as a shock because the family did not even have a camera. She never had a camera in her hands when she knew that she wanted to be a photographer. So she was not a photographer per se when she found her first job in the photography studio with Arnold Gante's studio, which was a very prestigious place at this time. So when she started to work in the studio, she was not a photographer. She didn't take photographs, but she did work in like the backstage of the studio, where she was helping with development, she was helping with the business. So we can say that she learned the business of photography from the bottom. And most likely from her employer, she got the first camera. After that, she started to photograph for herself, but she also continued working for the studios. And all the 7 photographers for whom she worked after Gante, she called them lovable old hags. Supposedly they didn't teach her anything. They were not good photographers according to her standards. So after that, she started attending photography courses at Columbia. And there she worked with Clarence White, who was one of the photographers, and now we call them pictorialists and romantic photographers, who even at this time had the style that would look like a bit dated. Nevertheless, he had a great influence on Dorothea, and we can really see these influences in her early work. So, So you have these two styles here, these two early influences. This is the portrait taken, this is self-portrait of Genthe, and this is the typical photograph Clarence H. White would take. So even on these two examples, you can see a difference. This is a photography portrait, like very powerful photography portrait, kind of modern. Clarence's H. White style is more something that would remind us of 19th century paintings. Pictorialists were photographers who thought about photography as an art form that should strive for the same aesthetic levels that painting achieved. So these are the two influences of Dorothea's formation years. But the first real jobs came after Dorothea and Fonzie had an idea to travel around the world. So these two girls took a ship to New Orleans, train to Los Angeles, from there to Oakland, and ferry to San Francisco, where all the money were stolen. So the trip went into a halt, and two girls decided to spend some time in San Francisco. They literally didn't have any money. So they spent some time living in Episcopal home for working girls, but it didn't go well. They were removed as disruptive elements, whatever it meant at this time. So they decided they needed some independence. Fonzie got a Western Union job, and Dorothea started to work in the developing department of Marsh and Company, where she worked in darkroom, and she started to meet people. Among them, influential photographers and influential people in the art work. This is when she started to work under the name of Lange. Nobody ever knew that she was really Nutzhorn. Even her two husbands never knew that she was really, that she had a different last name. She started to work in San Francisco Camera Club. And this is where she decided she needed her own studio. The idea how the studio came up is mysterious by itself. Many people helped her, and biographers speculate why they helped her, what did she promise, was she really that forceful, or was she really that convincing? But many people helped her to finance the studio. And the studio was located near Union Square. This was a very upscale location with the very high rent and the very high risk, which really speaks of her ambitions. Dorothea was very ambitious, she didn't hide it, and she always thought she could make it. So from the very beginning, she started to mingle in the art world. She was going to galleries, she was meeting artists, she was meeting people. But at the same time, she really cared about attracting business people to her studio. So she managed to create this absolutely fantastic for art world mix between artists and businessmen. She dressed dramatically. She was incredibly beautiful too. She had a talent to make friends. And she also had obvious talent for business, because not only she was taking photographs in her studio and she was charging significant money for this, but she organized something like the art salon in her studio. She was serving tea. She hired a beautiful receptionist. The jazz music was playing and they were dancing after 5 in the studio. So she attracted wealthy people who wanted to hang out with artists. And this is how she made her business. But also this way, actually earlier, but this was reinforced the the friendship and then the affair was reinforced by the studio. In 1919, she met a famous painter, Maynard Dixon, who was 19 years her senior. And in 1920, they were married. So this is how Dorothea photographed in the studio. This is absolutely not Dorothea we know now. So can you see how she's really affected by these early influences, how she wants to be in these early years as a pictorialist? She creates these photographs, these portraits, which are extremely beautiful, but also beautify the subjects. You can really see what she was paid for. So this doesn't say that she's not a fantastic photographer yet, because photography was very difficult at this time. So she does her job very well. She's just not this photographer that we know yet. Also, this has been a struggle for Dorothea all her life. She's going to become this extremely hardworking, influential, well-recognized, famous during her life photographer, but she, being not a feminist in a modern sense, she always tried to combine all the roles in her life. So after she married, she wanted to be this perfect wife. She was cooking, she was cleaning, she was running the household. She never expected the husband to be involved in any of the chores, of anything that would disturb his artistic work. So she was taking all these responsibilities on herself. But at the same time, she benefited from the marriage with Dixon because she was much younger than he was, and he was much more experienced in the art world. So he influenced her artistically and culturally. He also exposed her to nature and thought how to love the West. She was a girl from Hoboken. She knew the city. She didn't know the West. So he was taking her on his painting trips. He was taking her to see nature in the West, but not always. Very often, he was absent. He was unfaithful. He was extremely difficult. And this created a very turbulent marriage for her. So here is the family. With Maynard, Dorothea. We don't have many photographs of her. She didn't create many self-portraits, but she often photographed the family, and especially Maynard with sons, with children. These are some of her best photographs. People adored them. They were this royalty, bohemian couple in San Francisco. People adored them as a couple. They were like supposedly at the center of artistic and social life in San Francisco. Dorothea also wanted to be a perfect mother. And especially with two sons being born in 1925, 1928, and one daughter from Maynard's first marriage, Concy, who was 10-year-old and came into Dorothea's life as an already abused child. This was becoming more and more complicated. Having a difficult relationship with her own mother, Dorothea always dreamt about being a perfect mother. She had this fantasy of the perfect home, being a perfect wife, being a perfect mother, and also being an extremely fulfilled artist. So this was becoming more and more difficult, as you can imagine, and she always very often struggled with it, especially when Maynard not only left her with all these responsibilities, but he was also jealous of her success and very often very scornful of both her success, artistic success, financial success, but also of her clientele. And very often threw even more work her way. So these years, as the years to come, they really show how she struggled in all her roles. This becomes even more difficult during the Depression years. Depression years, which hit the art business the most. Art market practically evaporated. Dorothea's own business declined. So the family at the beginning decided to downsize. They bought a car and decided to move to Taos, to the farmhouse that didn't have any modern comforts. An interesting fact is that they bought a car and decided to drive to Taos in the situation that none of them could drive. So they actually learned how to drive for the purpose of this trip. They had a horrible accident on the way to Taos, which is not very surprising, but they managed to get there, lived there for 8 months, again with the entire difficulty of this life being Dorothea's responsibility, eventually moved back to San Francisco, which Dorothea found depressing and destroyed. But in the face of all this change, completely dissatisfied, unable to build the income they needed, she started slowly to reinvent herself. She gave up her studio. She started to work from home and started to walk the city. She started to walk San Francisco in the same way she walked New York City before, just observing the life. So in a way, all this change for much worse financially, depression, and all the deprivation that came with it, made Dorothea into a documentary photographer. In the meantime, with all the conflicts growing from the crisis, the couple started to live apart, with Dorothea, however, still supporting her husband. And they also did something which is hard to understand now. It was even hard to understand back then, because in the 1930s, the practice of sending children to board them with private families was almost completely abandoned in the United States. So Dorothea and Maynard, they decide they are going to send the children, who were at this time 7 and 4, to a school in San Anselmo and board them with the private family. This caused Dorothea a lot of anguish, and it also caused a lot of future problems with her sons. One of her sons called it later, it was a monstrous action on the side of his mother. It doesn't mean that the family fell apart completely. There are many trips when they're trying to rebound. And at the same time, Dorothea felt like she needed to free herself even a bit from all these responsibilities while she was reinventing herself. She was trying to reopen the studio unsuccessfully. And when she was trying to reopen the studio, actually the way she advertised it tells us a lot about her change in her mind. Before, she called her studio Portraits in Photography. Now she calls her work Pictures of People. So the switch is from portraits, in a sense, this is high art, to pictures, which is much more approachable. More and more, she dedicates her time to portraying the city. She adjusts her techniques, both while shooting and printing. She's not a trailblazer. Many photographers actually started to do this before her. Street photography, especially under Ansel Adams' influence, the opposition to pictorialism is already strong and steady, but she finds her own voice. She finds her own style. In the way, she photographs people on streets the same way as she photographed people in her studio. She says it herself. I didn't feel much difference between the portrait sitters and these people on streets. They were like, she found beauty in the same way she found beauty in her studio. So in a way, she still thinks about herself as a studio photographer, and she's very reluctant with sharing her street photography with anybody. She thinks about it more or less as an exercise. However, she's good. This is one of her earlier street photographs. So you can see, like, she's thinking about composition here. She's thinking about finding patterns. She's always thinking about finding light. She concentrates on the human aspect. What makes this photograph is really the face of this man looking at her. So even when she photographs misery, she thinks about the aesthetic side of this. And this is the photograph that becomes famous. This is one of her first street photographs that gain recognition. White Angel Red Line of 1933. So what she's doing now, she works as a street photographer. She tries to work on her studio. She supports her husband. She's sending money to support her children. She's playing all these roles. And at the same time, she's learning, she's growing, she's becoming a different kind of artist. Not very surprisingly, her marriage is going to fall apart. Dorothea was never politically involved. She was sympathetic to FDR, but she saw him more like the fellow polio survivor than a politician. So this was what really attracted her to the politics, to FDR. In 1935, however, she gets involved with progressive agricultural economist and professor, Paul Schuster Taylor, who introduces her more into progressive politics. Eventually, she's going to divorce Maynard, and this is a very difficult step on her side, because many of her friends, many of their mutual friends, many of the couple's friends are going to criticize her that she abandoned the older husband for a much younger man. However, this is not going to make her life any easier, because she's still going to take care of both Maynard, their 3 children, and Paul is going to bring to her life 3 children from his previous marriage. So what Dorothea is going to end up is 1 ex-husband, 6 children, and 1 new husband, who is not going to be very different when it comes to the responsibilities of marriage and family that Maynard was before him. So these 2 husbands are very different, because she has an artistic husband before. Now we have the scientist and the professor. But when it comes to the marriage and the responsibilities of the husbands, they are pretty much the same. Nevertheless, this marriage is going to last. And this is not only the marriage, this is the extraordinary partnership, full of mutual influences. Maynard introduced Dorothea to nature and art, Paul to the fields, to agriculture, and to progressive politics. They start working together. In 1935, he secured a leave from the university and became a field director of California's new division of rural rehabilitation. Dorothea traveled a lot with him, and she photographed for him. Together, they produced 5 phototextual reports to acquire funding from the relief funds. This is like her first step into this work, which from 35 to 39, she's going to do for Farm Security Administration. And this is Dorothea we know. So possibly, without her second husband's introduction to this kind of work, she could not get the job with the Farm Security Administration. What this work really was. Originally, all this incredible, so famous now, and such amazingly good photography project was thought as just a minor addition to the FSA public relations section. This was meant just as a side project. Royce Tyker was hired to promote the agency, and this was mostly to his hard work, what the agency did. At the peak, there are 21 employees, most of them male. You have some names here, some of them very famous, but my point is, this is a very interesting group of people put together, responsible for photographies of farms and farmers. None of them had any background in agriculture. And most of them were urban photographers, most of them also immigrants. So they are sent to photograph something that they have absolutely no idea about, which is contradictory kind of to how it should be done, but somehow it worked. The purpose was to expand nations' sympathy for the needy and support for the New Deal. Works of the photographers was published publicly, and journals and journalism came to depend on FSA materials. However, photographers who photographed for FSA were published anonymously. The work belonged to FSA. Work for FSA meant that photographers had to be constantly on the road. So they traveled around looking for subjects, photographing what they saw, developing their own styles. Dorothea's style became what we called visual psychology. Without knowing this, she didn't have words for this. She developed ethnographic approach. She created creative visual narratives. She liked words. She always supplied titles, subtitles. She interviewed her subjects. Not always these interviews were published. More often they didn't. And very often her titles were ignored. And she was always very angry about it because she thought that text was an important part of her work. However, these photographs, they speak for themselves. What is important for me is Dorothea was pretty much conservative with her equipment. She was disabled. She had problems walking very often. These problems became sometimes more prominent, but she was still carrying heavy, cumbersome equipment. And very importantly, FSA photographers, they had to send their negatives to the lab to be developed. She was not allowed to develop for herself. This means that photographers kind of lost control over what was printed. And sometimes they were surprised when they saw their photographs in print, because if you know anything about the photographic process, you're shooting one thing, and after it's printed, this is a different picture, depending on the skills of the lab. So she worked, at the beginning, she worked mostly in California, photographing crops, cotton, peas, carrots, potatoes, lettuce. So she was driving around, and every time she saw fields, she stopped and she photographed. She worked very slowly. All her assistants were always talking about this aspect of her work. Dorothea was very slow. She took time. She liked talking to people. She was not one of these photographers that ran around with a camera and just snapped some photographs and was out. She liked knowing people with whom he worked. It made her somehow, not very efficient, but it made her really, really good. She loved photographing working people. And even if she was not a feminist, when you look at her work, you can see she concentrated a lot on women. She liked photographing working women. She thought about herself as one of the working women. She earned 3,300 yearly. It was twice the Depression's average salary. But even if she earned this money, she always suffered from the fact that her individual photographs were not recognized for publication. They went together as the collective project. She also had many conflicts with Steiker, who was called the father of the group, but this father was very authoritarian and very tough. He fired her many times, and then he took her back. He finally fired her in 1939. Very often she was the only woman on the project. And being the only woman on the project was very difficult because other photographers very often traveled with wives, and wives took care of all the organizational aspect of work. Dorothea didn't have this comfort. She was doing everything by herself, or she hired an assistant for whom she paid. And also, only Dorothea on a team had children. Only Dorothea was disabled. And only she had a husband who demanded things. However, sometimes he accompanied her on the road. So finally, let's look at some of these photographs. These are the photographs of the crops I told you about. So again, you can look at the composition. She really knows about the composition. So what interests her is working people as a group, but also as individuals. And this is very important altogether about Dorothea's work. Even when she photographs people who are obviously in distress, she's always looking like for the positive aspects of this life. So like here, children. Families. Also, you can compare these two photographs here. When you look at this image on the left, we have a family. And the focus is more on the man here. And here's another portrait of the same woman, but with the focus on her. And I think like from these two photographs, this one is much stronger. This is what Dorothea really wants to show this mother. She loved photographing mothers. You can look at the face. The woman is obviously in a very stressful situation, but there is strength, determination. She's poor, but she's not poor at the same time. She also photographed fathers a lot. There is the entire series, Dust Bowl Dads. And again, they're obviously poor people, migrants. But in Dorothea's photographs, they're almost always clean. They're almost always, at least somebody's smiling. What she shows, she shows that these people still have dignity, that they work, that they strive, that they are resilient. Some other photographers would show them lounging, being lazy or violent. This aspect of migrants' lives never appear in Dorothea's photographs, or very rarely. So she takes these portraits. You can look at this man here. This is like her studio portrait. She wants these people be dignified, be virtuous, be beautiful. These are her words. Every photograph belongs to some place, has a place in history, can be fortified with words. And again, a tent and temporary living, but there is a sense of home here. There is a woman who is homemaker. There is laundry. There's always some food. Clothes are clean. And people seem, at least for a photograph, to enjoy themselves. As I said, mothers. This is one of Dorothea's incredible strengths. She was overcoming the racial issues by photographing women in their material roles, maternal roles, as one. No matter if white, Hispanic, Black, they're always mothers. and there is the same sense of dignity and beauty about them. This is from the project of Women of Plains. And this is probably the most famous of her photographs. This photograph shows how history treats images when you miss the context. The photograph of 1936, called The Migrant Mother, possibly one of the most reproduced of the Great Depression photographs, of Lange's photographs, but generally of American photographs. It was on 32 cents postage stamp. Dorothea took 7 photographs of this woman. She talked to her. She knew her. And for her, it was very important that the world knew her, that the world would know her by her identity. The name of this woman was Florence Thompson, and barely anybody knew, and I think that still barely anybody knows, that the woman in the photograph is not white. Would she become so famous if the world knew that Florence Thompson was Native American? Because she became a face of the migrants. She became like the migrant mother. But the world did not know that Florence was Native American, born in 1903 in a teepee in the Cherokee Reservation in Oklahoma. Florence had 11 children. She was the field worker and the waitress. This photograph tells you everything about Dorothea's style. This is a migrant mother, but at the same time, it's an extremely beautiful woman with 2 children, still like dressed in rags, but clean. She's not covered with dirt. Her face is incredibly beautiful. And while she's worrying, there is resilience on her face too. This photograph is staged. But what it means, staged? Dorothea encountered this woman with her children in real life. She did not bring them to the settings. But what she did, she asked the children to turn around. So all the focus would be on the mother, and the children are only flanking her. The children are becoming a background. So this is the best out of 7 photographs. But again, now photographers take 200 photographs and they choose one. Dorothea had a masterpiece out of 7. What is tragic about this photograph? Dorothea was not recognized for this photograph because this was one of the photographs taken by the collective, and the subject did not have any ideas what happened with her image. In 1958, Florence saw this photograph in the US camera, and she wrote a letter to complain. She demanded the withdrawal of all her images from the public circulation, which was never honored. Because once she was photographed in public, she was giving her rights to the photographer. Dorothea Lange was extremely shaken by the entire story. She couldn't do anything about it. She didn't have control of her own image either. And only in 1979, the project that tracked down the Depression-era photographic subject raised money for Florence, who was dying of cancer, and provided some relief to the woman who became the face of Great Depression, but never in any way benefited from the popularity of this image. She lived and died in extreme poverty. So Dorothea photographed in California, but then she moved with Taylor to the South, where she kept photographing, but more and more of her subjects are becoming people of color. But she photographs them exactly in the same way she would photograph wealthy subjects in her studio, always stressing how beautiful people are, how beautiful human roles are, how resilient, strong, smiling mothers and fathers and children are. I'm going to try to open this. Okay. Together with her husband, they published a book, An American Exodus, a record of human erosion. But the book, unfortunately, never got the attention it deserved. It was 1939, so the news of the book really took a backseat to the news of the historical events. But this was the good time generally for phototextuality, for photo books with texts. Margaret Bourke White published We Have Seen Their Faces, the book that Lange despised. She always thought it was sensational. It didn't show humans as they are, that the photographer was trying to make her own capital on this. Then James Agee and Walter Evans, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. This is at about the same time. So here's the book with Taylor's text and Lange's photographs. This is a very beautiful book, completely overlooked. Not only overlooked when it was published, but even now overlooked. Not many people know about this book's existence. Also, in addition to working for FSA, Dorothea took jobs with many other governmental agencies. For example, also not many people know that she was one, I think the only photographer who actually photographed on the governmental commission the Japanese internment, which must have been incredibly difficult to photograph for the government. Because she was hired by the US Army Western Defense Command to present the internment as humane and justified. So she had to work under severe requirements, restrictions, and censorship, which must have been extremely difficult for her because she was always striving to show what she thought was true. She did not enjoy neither the peace of her work nor her results. And this work has never been published, and she didn't see it. It was not published during her life. Now, more and more of these photographs are getting published. So this is actually from New York Times. So how do you photograph something like Japanese internment in these terms? The army wants the photographer to show that this is not bad at all, but she knows how bad it is. So how do you compromise these two aspects? How she went to do this? It was, again, following her own style, showing how beautiful people are even in extremely distressful situations. So this is probably what the army wanted the world to see, happy people doing many nice things. But again, can you see this? This is like the same kind of model of photography, father of the child, people at work, always different generations mixing, people well dressed, even while distressed, portraits, much meaningful situations, details. After that, she also worked for the Office of War Information and Defense. Again, strict requirements, very strict restrictions, what can or cannot be published. So what she was supposed to show was the work effort of ordinary people. But again, restrictions very, very limited her work. She completed 6 assignments there on Italian, Spanish, and Yugoslavian Americans, on students' lives, and on volunteer land army's vegetable seed production and the opening for the United Nations in San Francisco. Again, she considered her work disappointing and overly simplistic. Her best work on the same topic was created when she started to work commercially. She started to work on the commission for the Fortune, on the shipyard building in Richmond. So again, this is something that she really enjoyed, obviously, working people. Both men and women, and what she really liked and what her style became, like mixing of people of different races working together, which army was not very happy about to see. So these portraits were created only when she worked on commercial commissions. I think this is one of her strongest portraits. Unfortunately, by the end of the war, her health collapses seriously for the very first time. And not only her physical health, but also her mental health, and she plunges in the period of depression and there are the years without photographs, completely without photographs. Dixon's death in 1946 contributes to this. They were divorced for years, but they've been always in contact. And somehow deeply, she was always connected to him. Miraculously, she became much better in 1950s. During her last big collaboration with Magnum Agency, she became also a central figure in the founding of Aperture magazine. She started to teach photography courses in California School for Fine Arts, and she really found herself in the role of the teacher very rewarding. Also, what really gave her a lot of joy, she became the associate curator, however, without credits, to Steihan's 1955 Family of Men, the big project at the MoMA. Steihan found her overwhelming during this collaboration. However, During one of her trips to New York City, she collapsed from internal bleeding. And this was another big warning sign and a big hiatus in her work. At the same time, Tyler became a subject of anti-communist hysteria, and Dorothea was also affected, which came as a shock to her because she was never really politically involved or in any way politically vocal. What she photographed and how she presented the world was also the result, it was always the result of her conscious choices, how she saw the people. So in her late years, what really gave her joy was becoming a grandmother. She was a grandmother to 12 grandchildren. And after she made peace with her sons, not completely, but at least their relationship became better, she started to surround herself with children and grandchildren, and she became also a very successful gardener. So in her last late work, after she became better for the last time, she started to cooperate more on commercial projects. So she started to work for Life magazine. And this is when she thought she could do what she really wanted, to create photo essays. She also started to work on these photo essays with one of her sons. And he supplied essays, text, and captions. She photographed Mormon towns in Utah. She photographed in Ireland. She photographed a dam, Monticello Dam, and she also photographed the work of Oakland Public Defender. She hoped that all these works are going to be published and recognized, but only the first two were in a very limited form. She was dissatisfied with the results of her work. And between 1950 and 1967, mostly unwillingly, sick, and very unenthusiastic, she took upon herself a role of a wife who just traveled with her husband, who became a prominent person in the agricultural administration. So she traveled to Asia, South America, and Europe, where she also photographed. But these late photographs are probably the weakest of her work. It really shows that he worked the best with people with whom she could connect. Where she couldn't talk to people, she just didn't take her best photographs. She contracted malaria, and upon her return to Berkeley, where she spent most of her life, like the home was in Berkeley, she got diagnosed with cancer. At the same time, her solo exhibition at the MoMA was planned, and Sharkovsky traveled to meet her in San Francisco a couple of times. The exhibition was almost ready. However, she never lived to see it. These visits were documented on film. And the process of documentation of these visits was difficult for her, but she also, always enjoyed it. I gave her a lot of extra years to live. Just a second, I have to fix it. Oops, sorry. During her last years, she photographed family life and eventually died in October 1965. So how she's perceived now? Very often it's said that Lange's work being both critical and utopian. that she understood the society, but she portrayed it in a way as if it was better than it really was, as she wanted to see it. That she was a person, she was a photographer with a mission of the advancement of democratic vision, but she never voiced it. She rather presented it. She's been read very differently throughout the years. Obviously, during the Great Depression, she became symbolic to the national agenda. But at the same time, during the conservative 40s and 50s, her work fell completely out of fashion. She was almost completely forgotten. And then rediscovered in the progressive 60s. We don't know what you think about all this. She's never been openly political. Her message is mostly aesthetical. Her message is finding beauty in people in life, despite circumstances, despite the decorations. And even if she gained some recognition during her lifetime, she's been mostly discovered after her death. Why is it so? Because during her life, most of her photographs were published anonymously as the part of the group. Her name was not signed. And again, we don't know what you think of this, especially when this commercial success just hit in 2000s. In October 2005, a vintage print of her, the one I showed you of the soup kitchen in San Francisco, was sold for $822,400. And sometimes one has to think what should say. She always wanted to earn money. She was very practical. She had a family to support. She never hoped anybody would help her. She was taking all these roles of the mother, of the wife, of the husband, of the not the husband, of the breadwinner, of everybody she was taking upon herself. So she would definitely enjoy the money. Would she enjoy the recognition? I guess that she would, because she was always fighting for at least some recognition. However, what the ethical implication of the price tag on this photograph are, I'm not sure. So the last thing I would like to show you is her. Actually, in this promotional material from the moment. Just a second. I'm going to make sure you have the sound. Okay.
How do you tell others?
Okay, let's start from the beginning.
How do you tell others about what you think is worth telling? No one was ever given exact directions. You were turned loose in a region, and the assignment was see what is really there. What does it look like? What does it feel like? What actually is the human condition?
It's hard to get by. Between Buck Creek and Whitewater Creek, nobody can make a living.
I remember when the Yankees came through.
Yeah, a whole passel of them hollered and told the Negroes you free.
I don't know whether that drought was the devil's work or the Lord's work. In 3 days, everything wilted.
This country's a hard country. They won't help bury you here. You die, you're dead. That's all.
This life is simplicity boiled down.
Yes, sir, we've starved, stalled, and stranded.
Living a bum's life shouldn't make a bum
I was
out
born and
raised.
I couldn't do nothing if I went to Africa.
A human being has a right to stand like a tree has a right to stand.
They can't do no harm. The human face is the universal language. The same expressions are readable, understandable all over the world. It's explosions of emotion and passion, all concentrated on just this part of the human anatomy. One day I was working here, and it came to me. The deprived and the dislocated. And then the word came to me, rootless, the walking wounded. There was another phrase that was in my mind, the last ditch, the last ditch.
Hey, so I will be very happy to answer any questions you could have.
Everyone can unmute themselves now at this point if you want to ask a question.
Yes, thank you. I have a question.
Sure.
I was wondering who benefited from the sale of the print of hers in 2005, the one for $822,000, 400.
It's been not disclosed, but I guess that's the family, because that's her family is alive. She had many grandchildren, so I guess that must be some fund that would collect the money now. And I guess she would be very happy about it, right, if it goes to the family. But I'm not completely sure about it, because this photograph was taken, yeah, I think it would be family, because this was taken privately before she got involved with the governmental agencies. So this was her work. She never seized the copyrights to this photograph.
So what was the print exactly? I forgot what the...
It was, I can show it again. Is this photograph.
Ah, White Angel. Thank you.
No problem. You're welcome.
So I guess most of her photographs were in black and white since it was so early.
Yes, she photographed exclusively with black and white.
Yeah.
And also, if I can share this again with you, this is her camera. Even when in 1930s, and especially 1940s, 1950s, the small handheld cameras were available, she stuck with, she was still using this format. This is heavy. Not only this is heavy, this is difficult. It's much more difficult. She chose this despite all the fact that she had to carry her own equipment. But this people who work with medium format now, people who work with film now, right? Because now everybody works with digital. People who work with medium format or the large format, what they usually say, this is a different kind of work because I'm working slower, because everybody's snapping. This kind of camera forces you into a different kind of pace. She liked working slow. As I said, everybody who worked with her was thought it was like a curse how slow she was, but she was not slow. She was so, she paid so much attention. one of her assistants said, we are driving like 20 miles per hour maximum. And she was always, why are you going so fast? Why are you going so fast? I don't have time to look. Because this was how she saw the world. If you look at how photographers work, some of them are really fast. They see differently. She saw this way. She wanted to talk to these people. If you haven't noticed how the exhibition for the MoMA was actually titled, it was titled Words and Pictures. She wanted words, she listened, she always talked to these people. She almost like became friends. She always came and introduced herself. She said she worked for SA. She told them her name. She wanted to know names. She wanted to know backgrounds. She took notes. And I think that the most heartbreaking part for her was that this all was taken away from her, that it was never published like that. There were only images without giving credits. So now only, this is actually going to be put together. And this is why this exhibition was so important, because this is how it was presented, with titles and with words and with captions. Any other questions?
So I guess that she took a time, because those days, each time you press that button, it's going to cost you money.
Oh, yes, definitely. It costed, and very often photographers who worked in fields, they were forced to invest their own money into materials. If you think how materials were sent, right, how slow the process was, or how she asked for materials and her requests got lost or rejected, and just she needed them, so she bought it, right? And definitely, if you work with medium format, it's not cheap. So this is why she was so angry, and this is why they very often quarrel with Steiker over how her photographs were processed, because she was obviously a perfectionist. She was a perfectionist in her work and in her life. You know, like how she looked. She was a perfectionist in her image too. She wanted to be perceived as an interesting, attractive person. So she took time with everything. And she was really, really angry if somebody else did not take time with her work. Yeah, I can definitely, you know, connect to this. Like she was a perfectionist.
And of course, those days there was no automatic exposure. You had to decide what, you know, aperture settings and.
No. So you have to think about this, like how really careful you have to be, and how much each mistake is going to cost you. And sometimes there's an amazing situation, and if you don't do this well, the situation is gone, right?
That's right.
Yes, but like for me, it's very, very important that she really cared about her subjects, because this is what people very often think about photographers, that photographers like make their names at the cost of their subjects, especially when you think about like modern conflict photographers, like people who win Pulitzers, you know, and all this idea that photographers become famous and rich, and there is pain and suffering behind it. And how could you photograph something like this and just walk away with the image and make money and become famous? This, for her, was a big issue. She really felt like she was paying these people who became her subjects with her attention, that she was like giving back, because her work actually there for this, to attract public attention to these people and to attract this way, provide funds for them, public funds. But she didn't at the same time want to show them as miserable. This was absolutely out of the question. She wanted to show the truth, but the truth that these people still had some dignity and that they work hard. Just there were extremely hard times. And this is why they deserved help, because they tried. She was obviously very, very much hardworking person who overcame so many difficulties in her life, especially given her disability. That's almost nobody knew about because she was hiding it all the time. She was never like taking credit that she should have her work like easier because of polio. This was, nobody knew about it. And for me also the fact that she became a teacher later on and she wanted to teach. She was not like above teaching because, you know, like being a great famous photographer, you are going to have an exhibition, the MoMA, you know, and Tchaikovsky's coming to see you. She still wanted to teach. And this was important to her, like how photography is both a vision and a technical skill, because she started with this photography as art, and she later on became, you know, more like a documentary photographer, but she never gave up the fact that photography is art. So it's not like either or for her in this constant battle, is this art or this is just a skill, right? Because there is a machine involved. So she kind of combined both, that this is both art, but you still have to know how to calculate your exposure. And the saddest thing is how disappointed she was in her later work, that really, that there is no growing, that her best work was really with the FSA. And then she never created anything like this. You know, everybody in the work know that we would like to grow, right? She kind of stopped growing at a certain point, at least in her eyes. She was disappointed with almost everything she's done. She did after FSA. Maybe because she was so involved in this.
And she was a perfectionist.
Yeah, she was a perfectionist, right? And so she looked at her photographs from travels and she said, this is not good, this is not good, I'm not even going to show to anybody. She didn't show a lot of her work because she thought it was not good enough. So she really like chose what should be shown, and she enjoyed and she liked having control of. This is the big thing. Actually, with the FSA, she didn't have any control of what's been shown to the world, and this is why many of her works exist in public circulation. When she got control over what is presented to the world, she barely showed anything because it was not good enough. When Steiker had control, he was like, oh, this is good enough. This is going to sell. This is going to show, right? When she decided, she barely published.
I have a question. Have you seen her late work, when she was traveling in Europe and Asia? I mean, you say that she wasn't happy with it. She wasn't satisfied and she didn't feel she had the communication skills. But on the other hand, she always could find the universal. She wasn't really communicating in the Japanese internment camp, for example, and those are very, very powerful pictures. So I'm just wondering, perhaps there are many gems in this late photography, even if it doesn't have quite the power of her earlier work. I would just be curious to see some of it.
I didn't show any because they are really not good.
Okay, all right.
They're really not good. They're tourist photographs. You know, this is like when you take photographs in the passing, even if she couldn't communicate with people in the internment because of the restrictions, she spent some time there. During her travels, especially being a wife of the diplomat, she was like carried through this world. She didn't have any time to get involved with the people. And these photographs are like that.
So maybe part of the key was being, in a way, a solo practitioner out in the field. You know, when she was out in the migrant, fields, and she's traveling through the South, she's not being a wife. She's not being a mother at that moment. She's, And there's a sense also of open space where she finds these people, and even in the city she finds open space.
Oh, yes, yes, definitely. You know, photography is a very solitary experience. Most of the photographers would say this: you have to work alone to create good photographs, like to completely immerse yourself in what you're doing. Being a wife of a diplomat, being like kind of dependent on his itinerary, moving through this world without any control of your time and actions, could not provide any good photographs for this. And she didn't have time to really know these people, and it shows. They're like exotic at the best for her. She doesn't have any connection, and it really shows.
Well, and the other point is that she's a quintessentially American photographer.
Yes.
Chronicling the American experience, and
yes.
That's her strength.
Yes, so she didn't get this outside world really. Maybe because she didn't have enough time, or maybe because she was sick, maybe because she didn't want to be there. She wanted to be with her grandchildren and tendering her garden, and she was forced into the strips against her will, and she was just not in a good mental space for photography there. But nevertheless, she's been an amazing photographer, and she talks a lot about her practice, and I found it very, very brilliant ideas about photography generally. Even if, when you think about her education, she's not really an educated, like academically educated person. She, from her own practice, she was able to conceptualize her practice, to come to the conclusions that you usually learn at the PhD programs just by herself.
Well, I just want to mention, I did see the MoMA show, fortunately, very fortunately, right before everything closed. And it was absolutely extraordinary.
Yes, it was absolutely fantastic. And I was actually thinking about her. This is like, you know, like life becomes like ironic to the point it's cruel. She was like robbed of this exhibition, which was organized by Sharkovsky when she was dying. She didn't see it. And now with this huge exhibition, which was done as it should be done, it cut the public out of it. This is like absolutely, it's just not fair. Yeah.
Well, hopefully her children and the grandchildren have some, you know, satisfaction from it.
Yeah, I'm not sure, you know, like I didn't go deep because I rather looked at her work as a photographer than that her family relation, because if you read about her family relations, a lot of bitterness about, you know, like her sons always accusing her that that she didn't pay attention to family, that she chose career over being a mother, and her being constantly torn again between this being a photographer, the need to earn money, the internal need to fulfill her vision, and being a mother. As everybody knows, you cannot do everything in life, right? And she was like constantly like, she never like made a decision completely. She was trying to do everything here and there and this, and visit the children and bring the children back and support her husband and then go to the field again. It must have been exhausting. I've seen that her notes, have they ever been published? They've been published in this book I showed you. There's a lot of her notes in this book that she made with Taylor. A lot of her notes went to this book. And how large the printed photographs? These photographs, the advantage of working with such a camera is that you can print big photographs. You can print actually whatever you want from this camera. So this working with this camera gives you a lot of flexibility with the prints. And the prints are amazing. And another advantage of working with such a camera. I'm always thinking like what's going to happen to all our digital photographs, right? Which are somewhere in the cloud. What if the cloud disappears? And when I'm teaching photography, I'm always saying you're not a photographer until you print, because it looks so different on print than on your screen. Yeah. And what can you print from your camera? That's another question. Yeah. Any other questions?
I have in the chat that I know it's about Dorothea, not her family, but is it known if any of her immediate family got into photography?
I don't think so. I know that her son was making notes for her. He's a writer. One of her sons is a writer, but I don't think that they went into photography.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone, thanks for coming out tonight. We're going to, end it now at this point. Wonderful lecture. Thank you so much, Johanna, for the wonderful presentation. Okay, now we may have some do have question in chat here. Okay, I think we got all your questions, so we should be good to go. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Very good. Very good.
Thank you. I enjoy seeing you and talking about photography as always.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a good night, all.
Good night.
Take care.